And that's all. Please go ahead, Michael. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Jesus, for the invitation, and for anyone else who's involved in the organization of this network. It seems like a great thing. Yeah, I guess I should start seeing if I can share my screen, just so people can see what I'm talking about. Great. Does that look all right to everyone? Excellent. Yeah, so thanks again. Yeah, as was mentioned, so the title of this talk is Are Smarter Voters, or I think it was originally titled Are Knowledgeable Voters Better Voters? And basically what I'm going to do is try and suggest that the answer to that question is maybe not, especially when we look at some research that's coming out of social science, political psychology, political science, things like that. So I'll just launch in so that we can leave plenty of time for discussion. Kind of in the backdrop of this discussion is what I'm just calling the standard view here, where the standard view is basically this idea that democracies require knowledgeable citizens to function well. And so for instance, in this one book, What Americans Know About Politics and Why It Matters, which is regarded by many political scientists as the most authoritative study there is on voter knowledge, the authors declare that democracy functions best when its citizens are politically informed. So of course, if informed voters are needed for a democracy to flourish, then a well-known threat to democracy is political ignorance, which is something that's concerned a lot of theorists lately. And in general, I think worries about political ignorance have fostered at least two common reactions. So the first reaction is some people are optimistic and they want to find ways to increase voter knowledge. Sometimes they think that you can do this through the right sorts of shortcuts, or that maybe civic education campaigns can help, or whatever the case may be. But they tend to think that it'd be a good thing if we can increase voter knowledge. And the pessimists, they instead think that that's a bit of a lost hope. And instead, what we should try and do is try and limit the damage that's caused by ignorant voters. So for instance, they think we should either limit the powers of government or of voters themselves. But what I want to point out here is just that a kind of underlying assumption of both the defenders of democracy and its critics is that citizens who know more about politics are assumed to make better political choices. And indeed, it's this assumption that led Plato to reject democracy in favor of epistocracy, or rule of the knowers. And likewise, modern epistocrats, people such as Jason Brennan, argue that we should distribute political power in proportion to knowledge. And so the assumption is that those with more politically relevant knowledge will make better political decisions. And that's an assumption that I'd like to question. So what I'm going to argue here is that, at the very least, the relationship between political knowledge and voter competence is more complex than is often assumed by normative political theorists. So it's hopefully still somewhat provocative, but not so strong as to say that it's making a certain case for the claim, but rather I just want to suggest that, the relationship between political knowledge and voter competence is something worth considering in a bit more detail, because it's not clear to me that knowledgeable voters will always or often make better political choices. So at the heart of my argument is a kind of puzzle, where the puzzle is basically this. On the one hand, it seems like, as I've suggested, an informed citizenry is allegedly necessary for a well-functioning democracy. And yet, on the other hand, an increasing amount of evidence seems to suggest that the people who have the most political knowledge, as that's measured by social scientists, tend to be the ones who are the most likely to think in what I'll just call broadly corrupted, biased ways. So they're the most likely to engage in forms of politically motivated reasoning, for instance. So that's a kind of central puzzle that's at the heart of the argument. But I want to argue for 5 more specific claims in this talk. So the first one, which I've mentioned already, is that it's not obvious that more knowledgeable voters will make better political decisions. And relatedly, I want to suggest that attempts to remedy voter ignorance might be problematic, They might be problematic because partisans tend to become more polarized, dogmatic, and biased when they acquire more information. So it seems like giving people more politically relevant knowledge might actually foster or promote other kinds of intellectual vices. The third claim that I want to make is that a kind of implication of this idea is that some forms of epistocracy are going to be troubling, at least in part because these proposals would increase the political power of the most polarized and dogmatic and biased individuals. Then the fourth claim is that I'm actually going to maybe surprisingly suggest that a very restrictive form of epistocracy might actually escape the sort of challenge that I'm going to outline in this talk. But then I'll also suggest that that restrictive form of epistocracy will face its own challenges. And in particular, the idea is that they're going to face a kind of steeper trade-off than they would like between more inclusive forms of epistocracy and epistemic virtue. But I'll get to that towards the end. And then the last thing I want to emphasize is that solutions to voter incompetence are more complicated than we thought and must focus not just on increasing people's political knowledge or not just overcoming political ignorance, but also have to focus on what I'll just call the intellectual virtue of objectivity. So those are the 5 claims that I'm hoping to make in this talk. We'll see whether I convince you of any of them. But yeah, why don't we get going on the details? So I want to start by looking at some correlations between political knowledge, partisanship, and biased reasoning, motivated reasoning, various forms of corrupted thought, as I'll sometimes refer to it. So first, consider the fact that the most politically knowledgeable people also tend to be extremely partisan. So for example, the strongest supporters of the Republican Party tend to know more about politics than individuals with weak political ties. And that's true for Democrats as well in the US. Now, I don't think this fact alone should strike you as very surprising. And the reason for that is because the more, in general, the more someone cares about something, the more they are inclined to learn about that topic. So people who love coffee tend to know more about coffee. Motorbike enthusiasts tend to know more about motorbikes. And the biggest sports fans tend to acquire extensive knowledge of their favorite teams. And so politics here is really no different, is the thought. So the biggest political fans tend to consume the most information about politics. So that's the first kind of connection that I want to make between knowledge and partisanship. But the worry, however, is that the most politically partisan individuals are also the most likely to think in corrupted, biased ways. So just consider, for instance, the vast literature on politically motivated reasoning, which shows that we tend to seek out, uncritically accept, and better remember evidence that's favorable to our views, whereas we also tend to avoid, forget, and be more critical of counter evidence, right, of things that go against what we want to believe. And this seems especially true when it comes to political beliefs that matter to us. And there's also a host of literature in social identity theory on kind of in-group and out-group biases, which shows that partisanship encourages a variety of cognitive vices in individuals when it comes to evaluating members of other political groups. And so the thought here is just that when we strongly identify with a political team, we're motivated to protect our political beliefs from threats. And so when information tends to threaten our values or identity, we mobilize our intellectual artillery to destroy it, so to speak. So that's the second connection. It has to do with the relationship between partisanship and thinking in motivated or biased ways. And then the third thing that I want to mention is that this is how knowledge can possibly exacerbate epistemically bad thinking. So the idea here is that the more you know about a topic, the more ammunition you're going to have at your disposal to find reasons to reject facts, figures, and arguments that conflict with your preferred views. And there's actually a lot of evidence on this, but I'll just mention one, which comes from Charles Tabor and Milton Lodge, who compare people who know more about topics such as affirmative action and gun control with people who are less knowledgeable about those topics. And they basically found that partisans with more relevant knowledge were also the most susceptible to motivated bias because they possessed greater ammunition with which to argue against incongruent information. So information that went against their views. And a variety of studies indicate that knowledge doesn't correct for partisan bias or even mitigate it, but instead it actually often enhances politically motivated reasoning when you have more information. So just to summarize this kind of overview of the empirical literature here, the idea is that it's the knowledgeable individuals who tend to be the most partisan, right? So the people who know most about politics tend to be the ones who are the most emotionally invested in it. They also hold the strongest attitudes with the most confidence. And those are the same people who are the most likely to use their information to conform their assessments of the facts to their own political convictions. So that's a kind of just very quick overview of a lot of claims that have been made in this literature. So what I just a kind of clarification here, I'm not arguing, of course, that political knowledge will by itself corrupt political thinking. So I'm not claiming that more knowledge is the cause of epistemically bad reasoning. But rather, I think probably what's going on here is that increases in knowledge can be counterproductive, particularly when they occur in highly partisan individuals. And so it's likely, I think, that what's going on here is that partisanship is a sort of common underlying cause of both acquiring more politically relevant information as well as engaging in motivated reasoning. So it's like the more partisan you are, the more inclined you are to learn more, but also the more inclined you are to reason in motivated ways. But regardless of the direction of causation here, I think that there's, I mean, all that really matters, all that's interesting and relevant, I think, hopefully for the purpose of this talk, is that there's this very strong positive correlation between political knowledge, partisanship, and motivated reasoning. And so I think for that reason, we can't simply assume that people who do better on these political knowledge tests, the more informed voters, are going to be better for democracy. Indeed, they may even be worse for democracy if their stockpile of information is used to do things like repel challenges to theories and policies that are incorrect or harmful. So just to make this a bit simpler, I can kind of try and summarize this in terms of two different competing hypotheses. So there's this simple, I think, intuitive, widely held theory of politics, which I call the ignorance hypothesis. And according to this hypothesis, democracy is said to be dysfunctional, at least in part because citizens are relatively uninformed about political issues. And I think that this kind of hypothesis is the basis for many sort of civic education campaigns and science communication related to things like climate change, vaccine safety, GMO foods, and so on, where it's basically assumed that people need to know more about these issues in order to make better political choices or better decisions when they go to the polls. But actually, this account, I think, might get things backwards. So the psychological research that I've been at least alluding to seems to show that the more information that highly partisan individuals get, the more dogmatic they become and the deeper their disagreements grow. And so this suggests what I'm just calling the weaponized knowledge hypothesis, where according to this hypothesis, the more knowledgeable a partisan is about politics, the more stubborn, dogmatic, biased, polarized they tend to grow about politically charged topics. And so if this alternative hypothesis is true, then a smarter, better educated citizenry would not necessarily diminish polarization or lead to better policy decisions. It may just, I think, exacerbate some worrying political problems. So I think this leads us to a kind of conundrum or a dilemma where it's widely thought, as mentioned earlier, this is sort of a restatement of the earlier puzzle. It's widely thought that knowledgeable citizens are necessary for a democracy to function well, and yet the most knowledgeable, passionate voters are also the most ideological, and therefore, I think, the most likely to think in corrupted, biased ways. And so whilst it might be true that the vast majority of the public is shockingly ignorant of even basic political facts, it's in fact the knowledgeable partisans who are the most closed-minded and dogmatic, at least if we take a lot of this kind of psychological research at face value. And so I think this leaves us with a sort of uncomfortable trade-off, right? Which is that we have to decide now, it seems like, between whether we want ignorant voters or informed but dogmatic individuals, who I call informed dogmatists. Now, I'm not going to attempt to answer that question, like which of these two is better, but the point I'm trying to emphasize here is just that knowledgeable citizens are not obviously better, right, given this dilemma. And whilst some people might be less ignorant, they might also be more biased in various ways or reason in irrational ways, at least epistemically irrational ways. And so it looks like we might end up just trading one incompetence for another, but both of them might be pretty bad for democracy. And in fact, I think the problem gets even worse. So far, I've been looking at just acquiring more information about politically relevant topics, but it's not actually only knowledge or information that gives partisans more ammunition to reject unfavorable viewpoints, but rather also there seem to be very strong correlations between people's intelligence, education, critical reasoning, and epistemically bad behavior, so to speak. So our intelligence and reasoning is often hijacked, I think, in the service of political beliefs and more broadly, our identity constitutive beliefs, right? The beliefs that really matter to us, that we have an emotional connection to. So here's Tali Sherritt, who's basically saying something right along these lines. She says, if you perceive yourself as highly analytic, someone who has a strong ability to make use of quantitative data and a good reasoning capacity, brace yourself. People with stronger analytic abilities are more likely to twist data at will than people with low reasoning ability. And similarly, you find Michael Huemer saying something along these lines. So he basically says here that normally intelligence and education are aids to acquiring true beliefs, but when an individual has non-epistemic belief preferences, this need not be the case. And in fact, high intelligence and extensive knowledge of a subject may even worsen an individual's prospects for obtaining a true belief. And he says the reason is that a biased person uses their intelligence and education as tools for rationalizing beliefs. So in general, it seems like there's a lot of worrying evidence coming out of psychology suggesting that bias, dogmatism, polarization, these things are all positively correlated with things like one's education level, one's score on IQ tests, with numeracy skills, with cognitive reflection, how well people do on cognitive reflection tests, with more general reasoning skills, and even with the level of scientific knowledge that they have. And here I'm thinking of work by Dan Kahan. And so it seems like if what I've been talking about earlier, which has to do with levels of knowledge and information, if that's what gives partisans more ammunition to combat information that threatens their worldviews, then intelligence can be hijacked or is used as the sort of weapon for this information, right? So the more cognitive firepower that individuals have at their disposal, the more likely they are to twist the data and arguments to fit the conclusions they want. So I'm just going to take these psychological conclusions at face value and try and look at what's philosophically and normatively interesting about it. But if you're looking for evidence for some of these incredibly depressing claims, well, here's basically a list of the literature that I've been drawing on that indicates that this seems true. These experiments tend to illustrate the epistemically corrupting effects of partisanship, broadly speaking, on one's political beliefs. And so in summary, the thought here is that a variety of cognitive traits like IQ level, numeracy, cognitive reflection, as well as one's education and amount of scientific knowledge, these all are things which are seen to often magnify partisan bias and political polarization rather than mitigate it. Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour of the psychology. Now let's look at some implications. If we're supposing that everything I've been saying up until now is right, right? So if we're supposing that it is true that the most knowledgeable and educated and reflective voters are also the most ideological and therefore also the most likely to think in corrupted and biased ways. So what follows from this fact? Well, one quick thing I just want to mention is that it does suggest, I think, an interesting possibility for how to ameliorate political ignorance, which is if we know that it's the most partisan people who tend to learn the most about politics, then it looks like one way to diminish citizen ignorance would just be to try and get people to increase the strength of their partisan identities, right? To get them more invested in politics and in particular political groups or teams. So by increasing a person's loyalty to a political group, they then have more incentive to learn about politics. But of course, again, we face an uncomfortable trade-off here, right? Because it's well known that stronger partisan identities often lead to more political polarization. And so the more strongly a person identifies with a political team, the more their own perceived self-worth is kind of bound up with elevating their team and discriminating against opposing teams. And as a consequence of this, we see this increase in what's called affective polarization, or a kind of emotional polarization, where individuals grow to dislike, even loathe their political rivals. So again, that suggests a kind of uncomfortable trade-off, right? Which is that we can ameliorate political ignorance, but at the cost of increasing a form of polarization. But the thing I really want to focus on in terms of the implications is what this means for recent proposals coming from epistocrats. So if my argument so far is correct, then I think it can cast doubt on some of these epistocratic solutions to voter ignorance. Just for those who don't know, in an epistocracy, the idea is basically that political power is distributed in proportion to how much one knows about about politics, about politically relevant issues. And so epistocracy is often defended on the grounds that it can limit the damage that's caused by ignorant voters. But I think it's going to face some problems. So consider, for instance, a form of restricted suffrage, which limits voting only to citizens who pass a test of basic political knowledge, such as a voter qualification exam. So it seems like under such a system, what we end up doing, if the evidence that I've been looking at is correct, what we end up doing is we risk enhancing the political power of the very people who are seen to be the most likely to be biased, dogmatic, and polarized. And so by distributing political power on the basis of knowledge, I think we might end up empowering the very people that Jason Brennan in his book Against Democracy calls political hooligans, right? These are the people who are the most kind of irrational and emotionally invested in politics. So this might lead us to think, well, are there forms of epistocracy that don't merely test for political knowledge? And maybe we can sort of circumvent the problem that I've been trying to highlight. So for instance, consider John Stuart Mill's plural voting scheme, right? Where he says that we should basically give more votes to those with more education. But again, I think the psychological evidence casts doubt on this proposal. So if more education is seen to strongly correlate with dogmatism and polarization, then we would be distributing political power to individuals with those traits. And indeed, this is going to be true for any form of epistocracy, any epistocratic proposal that seeks to increase the political power of people who have traits, cognitive traits or education levels, that are known to predict things like dogmatism, bias, and polarization. So there's I think, a worry here for at least some versions of epistocracy. Now, it might be true that other forms can overcome the challenge that I've presented here. And of course, I think a lot's going to just depend on what the precise form the envisaged epistocratic institution takes. So you might suggest, for instance, that, well, if we could design selection mechanisms that were refined to identify citizens who are not just knowledgeable, but also less prone to various forms of, epistemically bad reasoning, bias, dogmatism, polarization, then maybe we'd be able to amplify the political power of those individuals without placing too much in the hands of knowledgeable yet biased dogmatists. And that might be true. That seems like a perfectly good idea in principle. But I think that the use of these refined selection mechanisms are going to face at least two important obstacles. So the first is going to be that these tests have to be sufficiently precise to distinguish between rational, knowledgeable citizens and their equally knowledgeable but less rational peers. And I think that might be easier said than done. And even in the first few pages of Against Democracy, Brennan basically admits that that would be a very difficult thing to do. And the second problem, I think, is that these tests have to be feasible in the sense that they can be used cheaply and effectively given large numbers of citizens. And these two problems are, of course, related, right? So we might again face a trade-off, but here the trade-off is between the reliability of the tests and their costs. And so I mention this just because I think a challenge for the epistocrat is to explain how they can mitigate against this kind of epistemic irrationality that I've been talking about in a feasible way. So I just mentioned this as a sort of challenge to epistocracy. Now, one objection that I was thinking about that people might have to the argument that I've been running is, well, couldn't you just say that informed dogmatists are still instrumentally better for democracy than ignorant non-dogmatists? So it's not really that bad of a dilemma, because even though we have a choice between either ignorant people, ignorant voters, or non-ignorant but somewhat dogmatic voters, that latter camp is still maybe much better for democracy. That might be true. The replies I have to that are basically, first, well, that's an open empirical question. It's not something you get for free. And I hope that one thing this paper does at the very least is it kind of calls attention to or drives more interest in exploring that question. The second reply I have to this is there's actually some evidence that maybe very tentative evidence, but indicates that this might not even be true, right? That it's not the case that informed dogmatists are at least always going to be better than ignorant non-dogmatists. And so, for instance, there's some evidence indicating that educated dogmatists actually have less accurate judgments on some issues than the less educated non-dogmatists. So here I cite an example from Hamilton, who basically found that highly educated Republicans who more strongly identified with the Republican Party actually had less accurate beliefs about global warming than less educated Republicans with weaker ties to that same party. And so this provides, I think, some tentative evidence that educated dogmatists might actually be worse for democracy, in a sense that when they go to the polls, they make choices that can really harm society at large. And yeah, okay. So that said, the main aim of this paper is not to suggest that informed dogmatists are worse for democracy. So this brings me back to an earlier point, but rather it's just to say that the relationship between political knowledge and voter competence is more complex than is often assumed. And in particular, it's not obvious that knowledgeable voters will make better political decisions, since attempts to remedy voter ignorance can promote other vices like dogmatism. Okay, so with that thought in mind, this now leads me to the part where I want to just shift emphasis a bit from concerns about voter ignorance to thinking about the virtue of political objectivity. So the idea here is that, given everything that I've said so far, we might ask, well, if more knowledgeable voters are not necessarily better for democracy or don't necessarily make better political decisions, then who will? And what I want to suggest is that we should expand our focus beyond looking just at voter knowledge to examine what I take to be at least a somewhat neglected epistemic virtue of political objectivity. So here I'm thinking of objectivity roughly as something like seeing the world as it is, not how you wish it were, or not how you want it to be. But another way I think of thinking about an objective person, or how to define objectivity, is as someone who's basically relatively free from cognitive bias. So they don't, I'll explain in a minute, they don't have to be entirely free, but relative to most of their peers, they are less inclined to engage in these bad forms of politically motivated reasoning. And so in general, the thought here is that a lack of objectivity is what's going to distort judgment. and lead people to process information in biased, partisan, motivated ways. So I can imagine that there are people who are skeptical about this proposal for a couple of reasons. So some people are skeptical of the very possibility of objective inquiry. And I think there's sort of two sources of this doubt. So the first one is that it's often been argued that scientific inquiry, for example, is a value-laden process. And so there's no kind of purely objective method of inquiry that's possible. But rather, inquiry is always going to involve a choice of questions, methods, interpretation, and that's where values are inevitably going to creep in. And I have a lot of sympathy with that view. I'm not really arguing against it. I just want to point out here, I'm not using objectivity to mean value-free. So that objection, I hope, is not really a problem for my view, but rather I'm using it to mean free of cognitive bias. And it certainly seems possible to let our values guide us, for instance, the value of truth, without being cognitively biased. So that's one possible worry that I'm hoping I won't have to deal with at too much length. The other one is that some people are skeptical that we can ever be unbiased. So this doesn't have to do with the way in which values get in, but they're just skeptical about even objectivity as I define it, whether that's possible. So I imagine this person saying something like, all reasoning is motivated reasoning. Again, I want to kind of remain neutral here. I want to say I have sympathy with that view, but whatever we might think about the possibility of complete objectivity, it certainly seems true that we can be biased to greater or lesser extents. After all, there's abundant research in psychology indicating that people engage in things like politically motivated reasoning to varying degrees, right? Some people do it more than others. And so even if it's true that total objectivity is an unrealizable ideal, I still think that it's an ideal that can be approximated to varying degrees. And it seems like that has to be true, otherwise we can't really make sense of the idea that people engage in motivated reasoning to various degrees. Okay, so I think objectivity here, I'm sort of just pointing to something I'm hoping to drive a bit more attention towards, which is that objectivity has this kind of crucial role to play in political environments that are characterized by partisanship and polarization. And whilst many political theorists have worried, I think, a lot about the extent and depth of political ignorance, one lesson we should take from recent work in psychology is that knowledge without objectivity might be unhelpful, right? Indeed, it might be harmful. So this now raises a bunch of questions about, I think, how to foster objectivity. And I don't really have a lot to say about that here. I think that's mainly an issue for psychology and applied epistemology. So I don't say much about it, but my aim here is really to just emphasize the kind of role and value of political objectivity, as well as to demonstrate that the problem of political ignorance is, I think, worse than we previously thought. And it's worse in the sense that it's unlikely that we can improve voter competence merely by increasing political knowledge, since partisans often become more polarized and dogmatic when they acquire more information. And so it looks like to solve the problem of voter ignorance, we're going to have to attend to other vices, such as dogmatism and epistemically bad forms of reasoning. Okay, so getting towards the end now. I think all of this has a kind of ironic and unfortunate upshot, which is that it seems like the people who are the most capable of political objectivity are also going to be the people who are the least likely to participate in politics. So the kind of people we want, those who are objective, are the ones who tend not to be invested in politics. And the reason for this is that partisanship, political engagement, and ideological dogmatism are all intimately connected, as I've been suggesting. And so, you know, the more politically partisan one is, the more likely one is to participate in politics. But also political participation tends to lead to epistemically bad behavior. This is kind of the main lesson of Brennan's argument in Against Democracy. He thinks that politics is bad for us for the most part, because it leads us to reason in these problematic ways. So the thought here is just that we display especially high levels of bias and are unable to control our preconceptions, and are the least motivated, I think, to be objective when we are the most invested in politics. And so the reason here is just, this is because open-mindedness and I think objectivity are just really difficult to sustain when somebody's self-interest or social identity or strong emotions make us want to reach certain conclusions. So just to summarize this thought, the idea here is just that the more politically partisan we become, the more elusive objectivity seems to be. And so I think this suggests that we might face yet another dilemma, which I call the dilemma of political objectivity. So the idea here is just that the more motivated one is to play the role of a democratic citizen, the more we are invested to get involved in politics, the less cognitively capable one is of meeting the epistemic requirements of rational behavior for democracy. And in contrast, the more cognitively able one is to fulfill these kinds of epistemic requirements for responsible citizenship, it seems like the less motivationally capable we are to fulfill this role, just because we don't have the right sort of connection between emotional investment and clear thinking. And so I think this leaves us with yet another uncomfortable trade-off, which is a promising way to promote objectivity would be by reducing people's emotional attachments to their political groups and to politics more generally. But by reducing the strength of their partisan identities, people will lose a lot of the motivation to learn about politics and to become active democratic citizens. Indeed, the people who spend the most time canvassing, campaigning, going to the polls tend to be the ones who are the most polarized and emotionally invested in this sort of way. All right, so I now want to just end on what I mentioned earlier was perhaps maybe the most surprising note of the talk, which is to return to something that Plato mentioned and think about whether or not Plato was right, even though his proposal was very quite radical, to put it mildly. So far, I've argued that informed partisans tend to use their knowledge in biased ways. But interestingly, there's actually some evidence which suggests that the people who are very well informed, kind of at the top end of these political information scales, end up being more capable of objective thought. And so there's some evidence which suggests that those who are in, say, the top 10% of these political knowledge tests, for those individuals, partisanship no longer dominates their thinking in a way that it does for people kind of in the middle of the scale, who like know more than average, but aren't part of what I call the information elite. And so just another way of putting this is that it looks like increases in political information do, for the most part, deepen polarization and promote dogmatism. But it also seems like this is true only up to a point. For this kind of informational elite, the people in the top 10% of these knowledge scales, they tend to be somewhat less dogmatic and polarized than those below them. Now, I mentioned this very tentatively, so a lot more empirical work needs to be done to establish this idea with any confidence. But I want to just think about an important upshot of this idea if it turns out to be true, right? And the upshot is that if this is correct, then I think it makes a very restrictive form of epistocracy that much more attractive, at least on epistemic grounds. And so it looks like if this last point is correct about the people being more clear thinking at the top end of the political knowledge scales, then it looks like it gives us hope for like an informed citizenry in some sense, but it's not a democratic citizenry anymore, right? Which brings us all the way back to Plato's political epistemology. So Plato was someone who in the Republic infamously rejected democracy in favor of what I take to be a highly restrictive form of epistocracy, right? So Plato wanted to limit the political power to a small class of genuine experts, or perhaps, on some readings, even to a single noble, wise philosopher king. So the ruler or rulers of this utopian city were not, for Plato, people who were simply knowledgeable. They were also supposed to be rational, unbiased, and reliable. So now, if it were to turn out, as suggested on the previous slide, that the most highly informed individuals, those at that kind of top end, 10% say of the scale, do tend to be less dogmatic and biased, then it looks like Plato's epistocracy might escape the challenge that I've been outlining in this talk. So now we can ask, well, should we therefore endorse a highly restrictive form of epistocracy given the worries that I've been mentioning? And again, this is not really a question I'm going to attempt to settle here, but rather what I want to do is just point out that there's still a problem here for epistocrats, which is that within debates about epistocracy, it's often assumed that more inclusive forms of epistocracy are better on like non-epistemic grounds than less inclusive forms. So for instance, even people like Jason Brennan in Against Democracy, where he defends epistocracy, he basically says that the case for epistocracy shouldn't hang on the hopes of a kind of philosopher king or guardian class. And indeed, he thinks that part of the way in which he tries to sell us epistocracy and make it seem more appealing is by saying, look, there are all these forms that still are that resemble representative democratic government in lots of ways, right? Or he even says that some forms of aristocracy don't require us to restrict the franchise and things like that. But insofar as those less restrictive forms of epistocracy are seen as somehow less objectionable, then it looks like we face yet another trade-off here, where the trade-off is, well, the kinds of people who have the cognitive traits that we're looking for to be reliable voters or leaders is going to lead us towards a more highly restrictive form of epistocracy. And so the worry here is that epistocrats are going to face a kind of steeper trade-off than they might have liked between inclusivity on the one hand, between the number of people they can either get to go to the polls or who they don't disenfranchise, and those who have the right kind of epistemic virtue on the other hand. And that trade-off might be steeper than even many epistocrats would like, just because if only a small amount of informational elite people are both knowledgeable and unbiased, then these kinds of proposals for modest epistocratic restrictions aren't really going to help us to secure the supposed epistemic virtues of an epistocracy, right? Which is what the motivation is for it in the first place. And so just to wrap this thought up, I think basically what I'm suggesting here is that contrary to what people like Brennan suggest, it might be that more extreme restrictives on the franchise are required in order to get the results that he's hoping for. So just to summarize, and then this is really the last slide, it looks like epistocrats therefore face this dilemma, right? So if they recommend more inclusive versions of epistocracy, then their view may end up increasing the political power of dogmatic and biased individuals. But on the other hand, if they recommend less inclusive, more restrictive versions of epistocracy, then they may face challenges by those who think that only modest epistocratic restrictions are morally acceptable. And that includes leading defenders of epistocracy who try and go in for that version, such as Brennan himself. Yeah, that's it. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, and for keeping the schedule so tight. And now we have plenty of time for the Q&As. The system will be the following. Please send me a private message by the chat and I will put you on the list. If you want to make a follow-up for something that is being discussed at that very moment, do tell me, please, in the message. You write follow-up or FU. Okay, thank you. Alessandra, please, you may go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Michael. I'm not putting my video on because I'm in the kitchen cooking dinner. So.
Okay, well, I hope it's tasty.
So it's a question about, to some extent, about the empirical evidence, and you know it better than I do, but I read it slightly differently from you, I think. So correct me if I'm mistaken. So the way I read it is, among the partisans, higher level of education are correlated with higher levels of partisanship, which is not to say that higher level of education are correlated with higher levels of partisanship. Right?
Sorry, I thought I'm confused. I thought maybe I misheard. I thought you said the same thing there.
No.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
so if you take, right, so there are two different possible correlations. Take the people who are educated and then see how levels of education correlate with partisanship, right? That's one thing. Another thing is take people who are partisans and then see whether among them there is a positive correlation between how partisan they are and how educated they are. That's a different claim.
Okay, yeah.
Right? So the empirical evidence I have seen makes the second claim, as far as I can tell, not the first one. But it seems to me that you rely on the first one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I need to go back and look at the studies specifically about education. I mean, maybe, yeah, the way I was reading it was, it seems like the people who tend to just have the most education also tend to be the ones who are not just more partisan, but also more likely to be, engage in kind of bad forms of reasoning, right? So tend to be the most likely to engage in forms of motivated reasoning when it comes to issues that they're invested in. So I was kind of reading it in terms of three connections, but yeah, do you think that, so I'm wondering why you think the interpretation I had might be problematic for the claims I'm looking to make in the paper?
Well, because, I mean, I'll have to reread it too, but I've always read it the way I read it, i.e. that once you look at the people who are partisans, you know, then you find in that cohort that there is a positive correlation with formal education. Well, I think it makes a difference because, for instance, your claim about one form of epistemocracy, the one that looks not at political knowledge tests, but at levels of formal education, the question remains completely open if I'm right about the interpretation of the evidence you looked at. It could very well turn out that on average, people who are better educated are less partisan.
Yeah, I need to go back and look at it. That's not how I read it. The way I read it was that, the people who tend to be, the people, if you look at just levels of education, the ones who have more education also tend to be more invested in politics, more likely to score higher on various kinds of self-identification scales for
I might very well be mistaken, Michael. I mean,
no, it's good. I mean,
I remember it.
No, I mean, I should learn this empirical literature more quickly because, I mean, in a way, what I'm doing is, as someone who's not a psychologist, looking to kind of amass as much kind of claims that these psychologists have made to then just say, if these claims are true, then what follows. But you're right that if I'm getting an interpretation wrong about, what follows from what.
Because Nick Bird, and then I'll shut up. Nick Bird was making a comment that your evidence is a bit selective in the chat. And I think it's true that there is evidence that seems to point the other way, but that is evidence that looks at the cohort of the educated and then looks at whether they are more, they tend to be more engaging in motivated cognition and more partisans. So it seems to me that if there is work that looks at the whole cohort of the educated, actually doesn't seem to show that they are more partisan. Sorry, I've taken.
No, that's really useful. I mean, I'm sure that there is evidence that goes in the other direction. I guess I'd be curious to know on which topics it seems like the evidence is mixed, right? Because there are a variety of different factors. So some of them have to do just with levels of political knowledge, right? How people score on political information scales. Some have to do with numeracy, some with IQs, some with basic scientific knowledge. And it might be that some of those correlations the data for some of those correlations are more mixed than for others. That certainly seems like it could be true based on what Nick's suggesting in the chat.
Okay, thank you. So now it's time to Felipe.
Hi, thank you. Great talk, Michael. I have a question. I'm not sure if I'm going to formulate it well, but maybe it's also correlated with what Alessandra told. So in Brazil, we have right now a shift of voting preference from the high educated people, formal education, and they voted, most of people who had a college degree or etc., they voted for the actual president. And then we have, usually in Brazil, people who are lower class and less educated voted voting also for left parties. And this in particular is interesting because we had the government of left parties that was what make Brazil and the fifth economy in the world, etc. So the idea should be, and the people who has more knowledge should vote for at least the parties that put Brazil with the best economy. And then it makes me think about the correlation between knowledge and competence. And for this I bring the idea between know-how and know-that. Usually when we talk about voting, we talk about that voters, they know how to vote. And means it doesn't mean necessarily that some kind of political knowledge is necessary for knowledge how. Like, for example, if I want to know how to ride a bicycle, I have to know, for some people, some proposition about how to ride a bicycle, but it doesn't mean that I have no knowledge how. Sometimes I need some kind of other knowledge to know how to ride a bicycle. And I think this discussion doesn't consider, I'm not sure if I'm correct, doesn't consider this relation. What kind of knowledge, what kind of political propositions are exactly necessary for knowing how to vote? Because, for example, again, in Brazil, we have favelas, and we have in favelas different social dynamics. We have militia, government, church, and everything. And this kind of knowledge, I think, should be important. People who live in favela, they know how to vote, at least related to their particular life. And this is not the political knowledge that people with high education have. So I'm just want to know what you think about this idea and this relation between competence, knowledge how, and this kind of knowledge information that we are discussing here, and etc. Thank you.
Thanks. No, that's super helpful. I wasn't conceiving of this in terms of a difference between know that and know how, but it sounds to me like I suppose the difference reminds me of a form of knowledge that people writing about political ignorance sometimes talk about, which is voters can often rely on rough and ready sort of heuristics, like are they doing better now than before? And that knowledge might ground competent voting, even though they lack more kind of explicit or propositional knowledge of like various facts about politics, right? The kinds of things that are tested on political knowledge scales. So I think that, conceptually, it makes sense to draw the distinction and think about whether or not it's possible for voters to have one competence and not the other. But I do wonder, I guess, what would ground that kind of know-how, if not some of the kind of more propositional forms of knowing that seem to fall into the other category, precisely because I think some of the people who wonder about voter competence often say things like, voters seem to express concern over the amount of money that's given to like foreign aid, but there's estimates about like how much is given are like radically off the mark. And insofar as like those sorts of assumptions are shaping their decisions when they go to the polls, it looks like know that is still going to be relevant. But if there was like an interesting, plausible story to be told about know-how that's not kind of grounded in the sort of information that I'm interested in, or that these studies are at least looking at, I'd be curious to know what it is, but it's hard for me to think about how you can vote reliably on the basis of know-how without having some politically relevant know that. But I'm open to being convinced, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now it's time to Javier.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the talk. So mine is just a general question about how this pessimistic picture of political practices compared to other social practices like science, for example. So in science, you could think that you have a similar structure. So the more invested agents, the ones that are more engaged, that are more invested in a position, for example, in a theory or a research program, would be, according to this evidence you have presented, more likely to gather information, to acquire knowledge, to be more informed, and they would also be more likely to be biased. They have preferences for certain beliefs or certain conclusions. So They are also typically they have have analytical skills and all these reasoning capacities that we saw that can be used as weapons to twist the evidence. So you have all that. Then do we have a pessimistic picture here in science as well, or are there mechanisms in science that allow objectivity to be guaranteed, or there's some level of objectivity, and the thing is that these mechanisms are lacking in political practices? And do you think that there are maybe lessons to be learned for how science works despite this sort of links between dogmatism and knowledge, and what happens in political practices?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is a really interesting question and something I have to think more about. I think that the points you're making maybe suggest, I almost want to say that it doesn't suggest that things are worse in science than we thought, but it might be a reason to think that things at the collective level in politics might be better than I'm suggesting, right? So what happens, I mean, insofar as I know anything about the story, which is very limited, the story in science, I think usually goes something like this, right? That even though you have individual researchers who might engage in what look like even epistemically irrational kind of practices, right? At the group level, this manifests in a really good way, right? Because when you have individuals who are overly dogmatic, despite the fact that they're resisting kind of existing paradigms in science, that can lead in the end to like more advancements in science, right? So it could be that maybe something similar could happen at the level of the collective, and this would be an argument in favor of, you know, aggregative democracy or something like that, where you have group intelligence as an emergent property, even though all the individual voters are behaving epistemically badly. That might be true. Some people have argued for that. I guess I need to think more about whether or not there are other kinds of mechanisms that help foster objectivity in science that are absent in the case of politics. My gut tells me that there is, but I need to think about what those are. I mean, that's just sort of a knee-jerk reaction. If there are mechanisms that seem to promote that more in science than in politics, then maybe an interesting thing we can do is to think about how to like structure politics to emulate science in these sorts of ways. But if there is no difference, then it would suggest that this is maybe a good reason to think that aggregative collective intelligence Democrats have got it right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Sounds good. Yes, thank you.
But yeah, thanks. I really need to think more about the comparisons and possible differences between those two.
Okay, I'm not sure if I have seen Fernando raising a hand by the other system, because Zoom has another system. No, okay, so now Francis Remedios, please. We cannot hear you, Francis.
I have to mute myself. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, Michael, thank you very much for your talk. It's very, very interesting. So I have just sort of two questions that are sort of linked to each other. So in terms of these weaponized voters that you're knowledge voters you're talking about, it seems like to me there's some sort of form of cognitive dissonance going on in terms of Fessinger, right? I mean, if you think of the COVID crisis, a lot of people are highly educated, very, very knowledgeable, but they don't want to wear masks, they don't want to be vaccinated, all sorts of things. And if you think of in terms of even the Trump voters, which are 70 million voters, I mean, a lot of those people are highly educated as well, right? So that's one part. And the other part in terms of what you have in the end there, in terms of the 10% who are supposed to be more the enlightened voters, in terms of epistemocracy, it sounds to me it's some sort of form of cognitive authoritarianism going on, right? In terms of what, you know, Plato's guardians. Anyway, I just want to read any comments on those 2 points.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. So the cognitive dissonance stuff. I mean, I think that what's going on in a lot of these cases might be a form of cognitive dissonance, depending on how, I guess, broad we are with that. I mean, I think of cognitive dissonance as basically you encounter information that's kind of runs against, you know, maybe like an assumption you have about yourself, right? So you think your beliefs are true, you think you're an intelligent person, there's a lot of information suggesting that you're wrong, you face some kind of cognitive dissonance. But I think that some of it might not fit under that lens, just because it seems like some of the people who are writing about this think of it more in terms of social identity and commitments to groups and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think you're right that cognitive dissonance is one trait, that one kind of psychological feature that humans have that can lead them to reason in motivated ways. But I guess just I happen to be reading a lot of the literature at the moment on like group identity, social identity theory, politically motivated reasoning. But I would want to put all of these under the same kind of umbrella of interest, insofar as they lead to the same sorts of behavior, like epistemically bad behavior. The cognitive authoritarianism. I think you're right. I mean, that's basically how I'm thinking of it. I'm not sure how worried to be about it yet, just because, as I mentioned, it's sort of like one study. And as far as I know, hasn't been, no one's done a replication study of it. But it would be interesting if something like that ended up being true, because then it looks like there's this kind of bell curve where the more information you get, the more motivated people become in their reasoning, but up into this point, and then all of a sudden the weight of reality breaks through and we can kind of like see things more clearly than we otherwise would have.
They get out of the cave.
Yeah, exactly. But it does seem like it's rare. I mean, I guess 10% of the population is still rather large. So you can still get, in many countries, millions of voters, which maybe epistocrats are fine with. It's certainly not the kind of few individuals that maybe Plato had in mind, or at least we associate with Plato. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now it's Maria Jimenez.
Hi, thanks. Yeah. So I had two questions. One is more about these the more optimistic picture you draw, where at least the people at the very top of the knowledge distribution seem to show more of the qualities that we would want in citizens. And then I was just wondering if you had thought about the possibility that maybe this means that in itself we can expect that even rising levels of education might make things better on their own, given that perhaps, given the evidence that you've been showing, perhaps we're at the worst possible point in the polarization curve, so to say, given that there's been like an expansion of education. Maybe we're at the worst point, but maybe that means that we're actually about to pass that tipping point and things might improve on their own. But so whether you had any thoughts on that, on the dynamics about that, or whether you think the 10% instead responds to some dynamics within the distribution, and there will always be sort of like an elite that will be illuminated regardless of the average level of education elsewhere. And the other question I had to do was prompted by Javier's comment about the comparison between science and politics in this regard. And then I was thinking maybe objectivity in that sense in politics seems harder to achieve or more difficult to expect than in science, because maybe it's the fact that interests are like a primary concern in politics and perhaps only secondary in science. You can think, well, maybe people are less objective in science because of their interest, but that's definitely the main stuff in politics. People come to politics because they have conflicting interests. So whether that brings the similarities that you might want to exploit, or whether that feeds into a very, very pessimistic view about the possibility of being objective in the realm of interest, like politics is. Oh, and whether that maybe points into, I don't know, like solutions that have to do with the moral qualities of citizens rather than with the knowledge.
Yeah, thanks. Those are both really interesting. And the second thing you'd mentioned points to, I think, a difference that I hadn't considered when dealing with the earlier comparison with science. I'll get to that in a second. So the first thing you mentioned is, well, could we be optimistic here because maybe we're just increasingly polarized because we're at this sort of particularly high point, but just before the threshold where we go into being more objective. I guess I would like to, I want that to be true, but I doubt it's true, or at the very least, I think as a general policy, I think it comes with a lot of large risks. So the reason I think it's risky, and then I'll say why I think it's probably not true, but the reason I think it's risky is that it suggests that what we should be doing is like going out and educating people more. But I think that if it's unlikely that we can expect citizens, because of just like the general incentives there are to learn about politics, if it's unlikely that we can expect citizens to reach that level of the informational elite, then what we'll end up doing is a kind of disastrous policy where we just give more people the ammunition that they need to become more polarized. So we need to be pretty confident, I think, in advance that we can elevate not the vast majority, but we can elevate enough people into the domain of the informational elite. And I'm doubtful that that's possible, because I just think that there aren't enough incentives to learn a lot about politics for kind of standard rational choice theories, right? I mean, we can try and get people really emotionally invested, but I just worry that I think it's more risky than it's worth, because you'll probably end up with a more polarized, more dogmatic electorate, even if it comes with some more informationally elite people. That at least seems to be like the risk that's invited by going that route. But maybe it's just a difference in whether or not, we have good reason to think that we can actually elevate enough people into that category. I'm sort of pessimistic about it, just because over the past like 60 years, generally, the people have, even though there's been a huge increase in the amount of information that's available to us, for the most part, everyone's scoring like roughly what they did 60 years ago on these various kinds of political knowledge tests, information scales, and things like that. So it doesn't seem just to be access to like information and education that makes the difference. But the second thing that you mentioned about possible differences between science and politics. So you mentioned interests, and I was actually thinking that that's something that's similar between scientists and voters, in the sense that scientists can, and philosophers too, any kind of scholar can be deeply invested in their own particular like research project or paradigm. And I actually suspect that philosophers are some of the worst offenders here, perhaps. So I'm talking about like knowledgeable citizens being dogmatic and biased in various ways. But I sometimes suspect that my colleagues are like this, just because we learn a lot about a discipline, but we're invested often in like a particular topic, right? And it makes it and then we learn the objections, and we can kind of do the moves. So I was thinking that interest might not be the relevant difference, but I could be wrong about this. Maybe you had something else in mind. I wouldn't think that interest is really the relevant difference here, but I was thinking, actually, was prompted by your comment to think that maybe a difference between why things go well in science and why they don't go well in politics, and maybe why they don't go well in philosophy even, is that in science and in daily life, we often have more kind of immediate negative feedback when we make bad choices. So like, if the example that I like is if you go to the grocery store and you buy a rotten fruit, you taste the bad choice immediately. But in politics, often people are rewarded for making bad choices, right? Because they make choices that allow them to fit in with their groups, to feel camaraderie, so on and so forth. And maybe if it's the case that in science, you get more negative, kind of direct, palpable negative feedback on the basis of bad choices, that would drive us towards this kind of objectivity and advancement more so than in the case of politics. So I guess, just to summarize, whilst I'm open to the idea that it could be interests that's doing the difference, that seems like it might run across both domains there, but instead it might be this other thing that just occurred to me while you were asking your question. I don't know if you sympathize with that or not at all, but it's helpful because it's prompted me to think more about the ways in which the two domains might come apart.
We have a follow-up by Alessandra Tansini.
Thank you. So I was surprised by aspects of your answer to Maria, because she suggested that perhaps increasing education can help. But even if you are right that there is a correlation in general, say, between education and partisanship, as you yourself pointed out, that could be because of a common cause. of political motivation, i.e. interest, both causing increased knowledge and increased polarization, then an intervention that targets levels of knowledge might not have the effect of increasing polarization, right? Because the knowledge and partisanship don't causally interact, right? They are both there. So we don't really know what effect it will have, I think.
Yeah,
so a comment and a question, sorry.
No, I agree. Just so I think I probably just should clarify, because I think I agree with everything you say. So I don't mean to say that, increases in education will necessarily like foster increases in partisanship, or increases in knowledge will foster increases in partisanship. That certainly seems true. I guess what I was worried about was, without the right incentives in place, it's going to be very difficult to increase people's political knowledge without also kind of increasing their partisanship and thereby increasing these other epistemically worrying features of thinking. Just because it seems like people don't really have the incentives to learn more about politics unless they're emotionally invested in it. I mean, maybe you could pay them lots of money, right? If someone paid me like, and some people have actually suggested this. So I think Ilya Soman says like, oh, we should have tests before elections, but they're not to rule people out. We can just offer like financial incentives for people who do especially well on the tests. So they might learn a lot, but without being motivated to do so by pre-existing partisanship commitments. But again, I think the worry is that, we have to strike the right balance here between incentivizing in the right way people to increase their knowledge without running the risk of these other sorts of epistemically bad byproducts that can result. But also, even just on a sort of more boring financial practical level, if we design the test in such a way that we have to design the test such that people are willing to learn a lot whilst it's financially feasible. So if we're only offering like big prizes for the people who do the score in the top like 1%, you might think that most people will just say, it's not worth studying because it's too hard to do that well. So it might just cost the government too much to make it feasible to get people to increase levels of information without a kind of emotional attachment, something like that. I don't know if that helps clarify what I was thinking, but.
Okay, so Nick Bird, please.
Hi, so thanks for the talk. I've been following your work for a while with great interest, and this is also interesting. So one of the main things I found myself asking is how much of your substantial conclusions would depend on your initial evaluation of the evidence. So this is kind of getting back to, I think, one of the first questions, but in particular, what I think I've been seeing in the literature lately is that when people examine more variables that other than just bias and reflection, they find that the motivated numeracy effect isn't quite what they're finding. They're finding something else, and it goes something like this. And I think this was suggested earlier by a question, so I'm not necessarily saying anything new until I get to the question. But the finding is something like, among people who are partisan, people do reason in motivated ways, but the recent literature suggests that cognitive reflection actually reduces that effect. So Kahan and colleagues early on did have a couple studies finding the opposite, where it was more pronounced, motivated reasoning was more pronounced among those with higher cognitive reflection, but newer and larger studies have found the opposite. And so I'm wondering, how, if at all, does that impact your conclusions?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I did see someone recommended a paper by Tebben and colleagues to me that seemed relevant here. And I think it's one of the ones that you'd mentioned. And because I'd written the paper at the time, I sort of have a footnote about it, and it's literature I have to look more at. I think you're right that it would obviously impact it in the sense that, if some of the empirical evidence that I'm citing is thrown into doubt because of more recent work, then I probably shouldn't be drawing on their findings in order to take the empirical evidence at face value to draw out the kind of interesting normative claims that I'm looking to make. But I guess a lot of it's going to turn on the fact that, I might be wrong here. I haven't looked at a lot of the Pennycook and Rand stuff yet. But if their focus is primarily on cognitive reflection, then that seems to be one of a large number of variables where people have seen these kinds of correlations. And I think, for the most part, I guess I was I was originally writing this paper just to concern political knowledge and like the literature on responses to ameliorating political ignorance. So I mean, yeah, maybe it's a kind of damage control exercise. Let's suppose it's true that the people who've said that cognitive reflection doesn't mitigate but exacerbates politically motivated reasoning are wrong. Then maybe what we can say is something like, well, is that also true for things like IQ, education, numeracy, and so on and so forth? If it ends up being false for all of these claims, then that would be interesting and a huge problem for, I think, psychologists, because it seems like there's a lot of data suggesting that there are these correlations. And if it turns out that all that were false, then that would be surprising, I suppose. But yeah, even if all that's true, I take that to fall maybe into the second component of the first two parts of the talk, where it's one part is on how well people do on political information scales, and the other is how various cognitive traits are connected to politically motivated reasoning. So if the literature you're thinking about is more kind of squarely tackling issues in that second camp, then it might still be true that instead of looking at both, the weapon, as I called it, like various forms of thinking, and the ammo, which is the information, the claim might just be true for the ammunition stuff. That might be right. But thank you for all the references. I will take a look at them.
Yeah, and thanks for that. That was actually really helpful to get me to understand like what, if anything, is relying on the particular evidence. So I appreciate that.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Now we have Eleonora Crespo.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what being biased is exactly in this context, because it would be great if we were all voting on some definite fact of the matter, which is either true or false, and then a competent voter is a reliable voter, is someone who gets things right most of the time, and well, we all know that story, and but that's hardly how things go for the most part. I mean, even sometimes we could say, well, there's some particular topic which if it receives support, I mean majority support, it will end up benefiting just a segment of the population, but not, most of the population. But still, there's genuine disagreement. So sometimes it's not clear, how to establish that truth, that moral truth or political truth or whatever. And sometimes, people could say, well, I'm voting, I'm aligned to a particular political party, and I use my analytic skills and whatever to arrive at the conclusion that this is the best way to vote, in this direction, just because I think those guys, are those who understood what's in the long run best for everybody, even if, in the short run, there's nothing like, going to the grocery and, noticing that you have just bought some rotten apples or whatever. So it gets tricky, so I don't know what you think about it.
No, thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. So I think I share your skepticism, or at least the kind of wanting to be hands-off about pointing to particular political choices, conclusions, outcomes, and saying like those are the right ones. So I'm not looking here to, I think there are truths in politics, but I'm hoping to remain neutral on that for the purposes of this paper. So I'm not understanding bias here. I'm hoping not, in terms of anything to do with like, these are conclusions that some people want, these are choices that some people think are good ones, and if you don't make those, then in some way you're biased. So I'm not thinking of it in those terms. I'm basically using it as a kind of catch-all for the various things that psychologists think are biases when they're running their studies. So one example would be something like, if you give someone sort of mixed evidence for a particular view, like data that somewhat suggests P and data that somewhat suggests not P, and the person who's already committed to P walks away thinking that evidence provides more evidence for P rather than not P. I'm thinking like that kind of constitutes a form of what looks like bias. So where two people who look at the exact same amount of evidence, or the exact same evidence, walk away with radically different conclusions about what the evidence shows, that's often kind of something that psychologists take to be bias. But it really depends on the paradigm. Like for all these studies, they try and tap these kinds of cognitive or epistemic traits in somewhat different ways. So not all of them will do it exactly like that. But the general answer to your question is, yeah, I agree with you. I'm not thinking here of bias in terms of something that's bound up with what we take to be truth in politics, but rather I'm using it as a kind of general term for the various forms of epistemically bad thinking that people who look at politically motivated reasoning take subjects to be engaged in when they're antecedently committed to certain conclusions being true, something like that. Does that help? Okay.
Yeah, helpful. Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks.
great, thanks.
Thank you, Leonora. So now it's time to Manuel de Pinedo.
Thank you for the talk, Michael. Look, I want to put to your consideration whether we could get out of the dilemma by looking at it on the opposite direction of the question that you make in the title of your talk. So rather than wondering what can knowledge do for politics, wondering what politics can do for knowledge. So let me try to explain what's my point. I mean, one of the premises of your argument is that there is a lot of evidence that shows that an increase in political knowledge tend to go hand in hand or tend to cause an increase in partisanship. But this is not necessarily so. You already mentioned that. I mean, one example came to my mind, doesn't have to do with politics, but with football. But my kids know very little about football. In fact, they don't care much about football, but they are huge Barcelona hooligans and anti-Real Madrid hooligans as well. And the opposite side of the spectrum, we would have Stephen Mumford, who was a lecturer there in Nottingham, probably before you arrived, who is a huge fan of football and knows a lot and has written about it, but supports nothing whatsoever. So maybe these are not common cases, but the fact that they are possible make me think that perhaps the problem is not so much that any increase in knowledge leads to an increase in partisanship, but that depends on how that knowledge is acquired. And then now it comes my point about looking at the question from the opposite direction. And here there is a beautiful argument by Protagoras, which I think that Plato has no answer to, which is that if people are forced, or if people participate in political deliberation and in decision making, then knowledge spreads through society. If everyone in society is potentially someone who can take decisions, for instance, if they end up being in a chamber that has been selected by sortition, then political knowledge inevitably will spread through the community. So the idea here would be, if we restrict our political participation to voting, then I think that your argument is quite strong. But if we think of political participation in more ambitious terms, then possibly more knowledgeable political participants are not necessarily more partisan if they have acquired their knowledge by means of actually having to take political decisions. So I don't know whether you consider that, but I think it's a way to get out of the paradox, even though it doesn't refer specifically to voting, but to political participation more generally. So I would like to know what you think about this.
Thanks. Yeah, I actually think I agree with everything that you say. So I think maybe some of the beginning perceived disagreement, if I'm right about it, is perhaps just due to me maybe making claims where it looks like I'm making causal claims that I want to be more neutral on. So I definitely don't want to say that like an increase, when people learn more about politics, they become more partisanship. So I don't want to say that, but I think instead it kind of goes the other way. The more partisan you are, the more you tend to learn about politics. And of course, you're right that none of these things are like necessarily so, right? So as you mentioned, people might have other sorts of incentives for learning about things where they're not emotionally invested. So you might think, for instance, yeah, you mentioned the case of the philosopher at Nottingham who knew a lot about football, I think it was, but didn't really support a particular team. Yeah, I can similarly think even in politics of some cases where perhaps certain journalists who cover, political issues, political policy, maybe know a lot, but they themselves are not like emotionally invested in politics. That might be right. But I guess what I'm thinking here is that there are just general kind of strong trends, positive correlations between these things, because the most common explanation, I think, for why it is that people, ordinary citizens, right, not playing a particular role where they have other sorts of incentives to learn about politics, right, professional or like financial or whatever the case may be. I think that for those citizens, given that there's this sort of strong, what looks like a strong positive correlation between partisanship and knowledge, we should be worried about looking to select competence by first testing people's knowledge alone, just because you're going to end up selecting lots of people from this pool, right? That where's this general trend towards a correlation between the two. So I think you're right. I don't want to make any strong kind of causal claims, at least in the direction of knowledge to partisanship. If anything, I think it goes the other way. And about the stuff towards, at the end about Plato and sortition, I think, again, you're right. And maybe it just has to do with the way in which we are changing the incentives for what it means to be invested in politics, right? So currently, because in kind of mass representative democracies, if it's true, the kind of rational choice story about voters having relatively little impact in terms of their vote making a difference, that's going to lead people to have different sorts of incentives to learn about politics. So their incentives include things like related to social identity, related to bonding with the right sorts of people who agree with them, and so on and so forth. But if we change the incentives by having a kind of sortition scheme, right, as they did in ancient Greece, or as even some modern philosophers have recommended, right? So Alex Guerrero, I think, is, Claudio Lopez Guerrero, I think, has suggested something similar, a sort of limited enfranchisement. So you disenfranchise everyone, and then through a random lottery, you select a sample of the population, and then those people have much more voting power, right? And just because of the limited number of votes, that might then incentivize them to like learn more about politics. I think that that's totally true. But I guess what I'm supposing is that then suggests a radical shift away from contemporary democracies as we know them, completely changing the incentive structures for getting engaged in politics. And then it starts to look closer to some of the epistocratic proposals, I suppose. But insofar as like, modern normative democratic theorists are looking to retain universal suffrage with representative government, then that looks like problematic, just given the incentives that political institution brings with it. So yeah, I think I basically agree with everything that you're saying, but think it's then just a question of whether we prefer to opt for that sort of political regime in favor of the one we currently have, but the problem would still remain for the one that we currently have, something like that.
Okay, so when we're getting exactly at 7:30 here in Spain, the list has ended. So I think everyone in that has been able to make his or her question. And I only have to thank Michael again for being here with us today. Thanks a lot. It's been a really interesting talk. And we will still have one or two more talks before the summer. So please keep posted, and we will hopefully see you again here very soon.
Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks to everyone for coming and for your questions. This was really, really helpful. It's a lot for me to think about and revise the paper.